Alrighty, well, then if you're ready, we can begin.
Sure, great.
Alrighty. I've got a little introduction to read here. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your time and agreeing to meet with me today. I'm exploring the perspective of a global leader within the context of food security and management. So, what is your area of expertise within global food insecurity?
Okay, so I'm a professor at Kansas State University, and my area of specialization is in agricultural economics. And so I've been working in this area of since 1996 after my PhD. I work primarily in the area of impact assessment of new agricultural technologies. And I've worked on looking at new rice varieties, new corn varieties, but most of my career has been focused on dryland cereals such as sorghum and pearl millet.
Fantastic. What are the areas that have experienced food insecurity that you've been working in, like areas around the globe?
So most of my work has been in Africa, and I'd say even within that in West Africa. So I, in 1996, I worked for 3 years at an international agricultural research center focusing on rice. That was the center at that time was called the West Africa Rice Development Association. It's now the African Rice Institute. After that, I went into academics, and so I worked with a number of organizations in my academic career since 2000, such as the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, many of the CGIAR centers, again, working on impact assessment. And those have taken me to a couple of other areas of Africa, East Africa, working on maize, Southern Africa as well in that. Also looking at pigeon peas. And again, because of my interest in sorghum in Ethiopia, where they grow quite a bit of sorghum, and it's a very important crop for their food security system. But really, it's been focused on West Africa. And when I don't think about rice, it's really been in the Sahelian countries, so Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Senegal.
Yes, sir. Fantastic. Thank you. What are the greatest issues you would say that we are facing globally with food security?
Well, I think there's a couple of main issues, and they're really different. So I'm going to talk about one which I think is only getting worse and worse over time, and it's really that the role of humans and the role that they play in food security. So much of our extreme hunger and famine is largely human induced, and yet we focus most upon climate change and other types of shocks, locusts and other pests that affect crop production. But most malnutrition is human induced. So it's war, it's regional conflicts, it's national conflicts, political retribution. And those are the issues which I find most troubling, because that's the area where I feel like I have the least to contribute. And
Yes, sir.
so food security is largely, a function of the production, consumption, the food system itself, but also the political and social system where those activities are conducted. And so at that level, I'm just kind of powerless to do much about those types of human-induced conflicts. The second area is that I've really focused on following agricultural productivity over time, and through looking at the impact of new crop varieties or farming practices or crop and resource management practices. There were many points in time when we felt we were very optimistic about where we were going to meet future food needs. Just less than a month ago, the most recent report, the GAP report, Global Agricultural Productivity Project report, was released, and it indicated that the 10-year rolling average has found that the total factor productivity, a measure of our overall productivity growth, dropped to 0.7%. That's less than half of what we need to keep up with growing demands on food around the world. So I find that deeply troubling. And, I've got several hypotheses about what I think is driving that. One, I think there's lackadaisical perception on how important it is to invest in agricultural research. So that's one side of it. I fear that climate change has really just made so many environments more difficult to grow crops in. And while you might think a little bit of a reduction in crop productivity is not a big deal over a large area, it adds up. And so I worry about that, those two factors contributing to the slowdown in agricultural productivity growth. And so that's probably the one thing that I do feel I can have an impact on. And I continue to write on that and talk about investments and what's working and what's not. And hopefully that translates to some public policy actions that, try to turn that around.
Yes, sir. Absolutely fantastic. Those are two very major issues you touched on. Absolutely. So in most of these areas that you've been working, are there any efforts from the locals to try to help manage their food supply better? And is it working?
Oh, absolutely. So one thing that I am strongly vested in is using the U.S. University and U.S. Department of Agriculture strengths to work with counterparts at African universities and African agricultural research institutes to build capacity and to work jointly on common problems, because many of these problems that we're addressing in West Africa are common to the United States. So heat and drought stress, in particular, insect pests that affect crops there affect similarly in the United States. So on a research scale, certainly those populations are working on those problems. They're underfunded. And so collaborative work between that I've managed through USAID and those countries, and linking US partners with those counterparts, is extremely effective. And so we found a lot of great technological change. In working in West Africa, there's a very strong agricultural cooperative structure in place. So many of these cooperatives are multifaceted, working not only on agriculture, but working on literacy and hygiene and water. And those groups are very eager to work with research, test and innovate on their own. So the answer to that is an obvious, yes, of course they're working on this themselves. And sometimes what is needed is something that kind of radically changes and shocks the system, something that they haven't thought about, which adds into their own understanding of their own environment and its capacity and its productive capacity and the social systems under which they work. And so I found these relationships to be, very strong and powerful. And, I still receive emails and WhatsApp messages from, mayors out in these little tiny villages in the middle of Niger that, we've had discussions with and worked on projects with, still seeking additional advice. So they're very active, and in no way would I think of them as being passive, but they're doing as much as they possibly can. And sometimes what they need is that new knowledge or that innovation from agricultural research to shake things up.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Absolutely. I think you might have touched on this a little bit, but can you speak more to what is currently being done by outside organizations to help combat these issues at the local, regional, national, and worldwide levels?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on there, and so I could talk for hours on this at several different levels, whether it be from, a multinational perspective. But what I've spent the past decade on, more than the past decade, since, the early 2000 and teens to now, and I'm also a product of, was USAID funded linkages between US universities and national programs. And this has kind of been a real interesting two-way street where on one hand, there's the problem-solving role that we play at working on these problems together. There's a secondary, and maybe in some cases as equally important, issue of capacity building and training that takes place with students from African nations and elsewhere that come to the U.S. to get a PhD or a master's degree in ag econ or agronomy or plant science or plant breeding or genomics. And so those activities to build that foundation for being able to do the research yourself is critically important over the long run. And it just doesn't really get the same level of recognition that maybe a new crop variety or a new technology might have, and perhaps is less flashy, but it's critically important for the long run sustainability of improved agricultural productivity. So I think that the US is very unique in the way it does these programs. No other European nation or Asian nation that engages in this does this in the same way that the US does and trains so many nationals. So, for example, in the 10 years that I led a program on sorghum and millet, focusing on Ethiopia, Niger, and Senegal, we trained 96 students, masters, PhDs, a couple of engineers to work on these topics for the target nations. And so some of those were supporting students within their own countries to pursue a degree and funding their research activities. Some went to third-party nations, like they went from Senegal and Niger down to Ghana, which has a very strong plant breeding program, or to South Africa. And a very small fraction, maybe about a third, came to the United States and received their degrees here. So that's something that I'm extremely proud of, investing in those individuals to provide that knowledge and leadership into the future. And, looking back at this USAID mechanism, it's got to start back in the 1970s. We see examples of individuals that came much earlier, and they're now global leaders in international agriculture or international development in general. So it's a key piece that nobody around the world does as well as the United States, is training on some of these very difficult topics. We invest more in it. Others may have similar interests, but we're the ones who really invest in the training. It's expensive, but it has a long run payoff as opposed to, short run impacts.
Yes, sir. Absolutely, for sure. What would you say that the role of water insecurity is playing within the food insecurity bigger picture?
It's interesting that you asked that question because I work in semi-arid areas. Water problems are always there. So it's not like it's something new. So more so than water insecurity or access to groundwater, surface water, is just really growing aridity, changes in rainfall patterns that make many crops less resilient. And that's kind of more concerns me more than actually sort of water insecurity in particular, is just, are we developing and adapting to this changing environment quickly enough to ward off productivity losses? So that's kind of what I think about in this area.
Yes, sir. What is your perspective on the food loss and food waste worldwide, and what could be done to mitigate it to help these countries that are not as food secure?
Okay, it's a great question. So I'm an economist, right? And so I'm always, I don't know how much economics you've had, but I'm always thinking at the margin. And I know that there's certainly a cost to food waste, but on the other hand, there's a cost to food preservation or preventing those losses. And you're going to have to find a balance and equilibrium between the loss and the preventing loss kind of curves.
Yes,
So
sir.
doing this is quite expensive. And so we're always going to see food loss, wastage, um, uh, losses to pests that attack those staples. You're going to see that. And the only way to get around that is through investment in storage and prevention. So that side of the equation is the prevention of it is expensive. There's some lower cost innovations, but often these can be expensive enough for smallholders that it just doesn't make economic sense. It's out of their reach. Now, in fact, of wastage of food that could potentially be saved and consumed, that's a difficult one for me to get a grasp on because that really talks to the issue of behavioral change of individuals, and behavioral change is very, very difficult, and you have to pick your battles, and that's certainly not one that I've thought a lot on about how to change human behavior to solve those ways. So in a nutshell, for me, there's always going to be food loss, food waste. It's just the economic, at the present time, that's the economically optimal thing to do. And so there are certainly places around the world where you're taxed based upon the amount of food that goes into the trash. You have to pay for that. So that induces less wastage. And as an economist, I would like to see some sort of incentives to become more frugal with our food consumption patterns, and then also continued innovation, engineering, agricultural engineering innovation into lower cost food storage to prevent that actual loss from occurring. So it's not an easy problem to solve. And to me, trying to get down to a zero waste loss, or these equations about how much food is lost per year and how much individuals could, how much better our nutrition would be if we didn't waste that, are somewhat kind of Trojan horse false flags that we're following, because yes, you could get there if you had unlimited amount of money to spend on those topics, which we don't. Therefore, some waste and loss is going to be optimal from an economic perspective. Doesn't mean that it's good, but it's the economic optimal.
Yes, sir. That's a very interesting perspective on it, and it is a very difficult issue to even figure out how to address. Um, what did I have next? Oh, I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, but how do you say we should address the intersection of food security and political instability in certain
Oh yeah,
regions?
no, it's horrible. It's heart-wrenching. It's 10 years of my career was spent working in Niger. Niger is one of the poorest nations in the world. Incredible progress, both within the research system, within the equivalent of USDA there, linking those researchers with farmer cooperatives, very eager farmers willing to try things. Success is being made. The farmers are becoming more and more curious, more innovative. And then you have a coup d'etat, military government's installed, USAID withdraws, and we're at a complete sort of artificial standstill. And that sort of positive trend towards improved food security is kind of, that rug is pulled out from underneath your feet. And so how could the United States have prevented something like this? It's an impossible issue. I mean, many of these that were involved in the coup d'etat were actually trained and attended military leadership trainings in the United States. And so there's just an entire environment behind what we do, which maybe it's easy for me to not pay attention to. I don't pay attention to the political dynamics. I know conditions and safety and security were becoming more and more problematic, I should say. I didn't know it was going to boil over in such a way that it was going to result in a coup. And that wasn't really, while some people said they weren't surprised about it, some of my colleagues said they weren't surprised about it, and some are even supportive of it to try to improve security. I just have to react and throw up my hands and work informally with these individuals and keep in contact as best as we can, and we'll see what the future holds. But it's, as many others have already said, more than 50% of all of our famines are caused by humans and not by natural disasters.
Yes, sir. Like you said, nearly an impossible thing to figure out how to address as well. How important would you
sorry, Riley, and that sort of the way I
ahead.
always talk about it with students is that humans are far more complicated than environmental change and climate
Yes,
change,
sir. 100%. Absolutely. How would you say, how important is it to integrate nutrition education along with our food security efforts?
It's really important, and there's a lot of clever ways that it can be done. Most the gains in agricultural productivity have been very commodity focused, and so that's really driving quite a bit of what we do. I think we have, because we focused on commodities and not so much on fruits and vegetables or even legumes, outside of some of the major ones, that we don't really know what's going on the ground with the consumption of these types of products. And so that makes our understanding of how diverse the food basket is of so many different, in so many different locations. So there's one that we don't really know, what's missing. In many cases, we've got estimates of micronutrient deficiencies. And because some of these estimates are so large, we focus on ways to combat that. And so there's lots of different ways you can go about this. So one, your question was, how important is nutritional education? It's very important, right? But it's as equally important as diversifying the sources of those nutrients that are available. So people, once they do understand the role of iron, zinc, or vitamin C in their diets, that they have multiple different ways to consume that micronutrient. One of the things which I think is very innovative, and back to my colleagues in Niger, so we were taking the traditional staples that are produced, sorghum millet, a lot of cowpeas, a lot of peanuts. And the value-added food processing team that we worked with was milling those and then creating porridge mixes that were composite blends of a cereal and of a legume. Mm-hmm. So there you would get a more balanced nutritional product. And so you're taking and introducing higher amounts of proteins into diets. Well, that's a first step, right? That's a macronutrient. And then once populations were finding that, our children really prefer the millet and peanut over the millet and cowpea, or it's millet, peanut, and cowpea, or these mixtures that they fine-tune to local taste, the next step was what we call food-to-food fortification. So you take locally available nutrient-dense foods and add them into these porridge mix blends. So for example, green leafy vegetables like moringa, which are very high in iron, or orange fleshed fruits and vegetables, sweet potatoes or papayas type of products to build in greater vitamin A content. And even little small spices that would improve palatability of some of these blends. So yes, the children preferred peanuts over cowpeas as their protein source. But if you add a little bit of cardamom, which was locally grown, or other spices in there, that changed the perspective. So on one hand, it's knowing the importance of macro and micro nutrients in your diet. And I think that's, nutritional knowledge may not be perfect, but I think most populations have a good sense of what they should eat. And then just like we know what we should eat, sometimes we don't because we don't prefer the taste of it.
Mm-hmm.
Finding clever ways to adapt to the tastes and preferences of populations is often equally important to nutritional education to ensure that they make good on that nutritional information.
Yes, sir. Fantastic. I think we are just about out of time, but thank you so much for all of your insight and sharing all of your knowledge in these areas with me.
Well, you're very welcome and good luck on your studies. And I hope you're a future leader in this area because we need a constant stream of people dedicated to this topic. It's very, very hard work and but very, very rewarding. And I've had a great career at it. So good luck.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
You're
Have a great
welcome.
day.
Have a good day. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you, you too.